And I think we might as well start because it is that time. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So I'm in my underground bunker about 1 mile below Charlotte County in an undisclosed area. So don't try to find me. What I'm going to do is when we begin is I'm going to mute all your microphones.
Okay, so he's gonna have.
But there is this other thing, and it's called the chat room. And what you can do is if you have a question, just go ahead and stick it in the chat box there, and you can send it, and then during a break, I'll look it over and try to address those questions. We'll try to go, I don't know, 50 minutes or less per segment, and then I will we'll take a bio break of sorts for like 10 minutes, and then we'll start back. It is being recorded, though, too. So that's the other good news. Are there any questions for the good of the group?
Not so far.
Okay.
Will we continue to have these online classes
Yes.
Tuesdays and Thursdays?
Yes. I'm planning on having the next one a week from today, 9:30. It will be on ants and termites.
Ooh.
I'm trying to do the ones that I can do first. So as we push,
Oh, my favorite.
As we push through the virus, hopefully as things clear up on the other end, we can get the special guests either to come on board, because I know we got one that's coming on board for tropical fruit, so he's all set. But the others who were supposed to be in person, we'll see, you know, if they can come in person later on, you know, maybe whatever, or even come on board like we're doing here, which I think they could do too. So this is our first pilot program on this, and so I think let's go with it. And again, this is on Turf. Can everybody see the PowerPoint fine?
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. I am going to mute you all. So in a minute, you will become voiceless.
Oh, my husband would like that.
There you go. Now, just as a test to make sure you can hear me, if you can raise your hand. Okay, I see Sarah with her hand up. That's a good sign. Okay, okay. Michelle raised her hand too. Okay. Oh, I see others who have raised hands. Good, good, good. All right, so while turf is maybe not your favorite topic, it is one that brings about a lot of questions to people. And certainly we're going to delve into it. It used to be my least favorite too. I just feel more comfortable with it now, I guess. So my subtitle is Your Lawn, Learn It, Live It, Love It. You could leave it, I suppose, too, at the same point. However, there's a lot of stuff that you can take out of this that's general information that will bring you light years ahead from your neighbors. Oops. Oh, there it is. Oops. Have a little delay with that. All right. Often a person will ask me, what's the best turf? Recommend the best turf. And I always say, there's no perfect turf. They all have their advantages and disadvantages, and you can't get away from that. And especially when they want you to pick out the one. I said, well, we'll talk about what's good, bad, and indifferent about these, and then you're going to have to pick it out as per your ability to take care of it. And the other one is lawns go from order to disorder. One day your lawn's perfect, the next day you got a miniature pig on it. You know, you never know what's going to happen with those. All right. But turf as a plant has value, and it's one of the best plants for cleaning water because of the fibrous roots. It takes up nitrogen and pollutants very, very easily and well. It looks good. It cools the air. It takes care of glare and noise, stops erosion. But for sure, it is something that ties the rest of the landscape together as well. But as far as things about pollutants, turf is perhaps the very best pollutant picker-upper and cleaner. So what makes a turf grass a grass? Well, it's regular maintenance, keeping in mind that a lot of these were pasture grasses that have been adapted or selected for our landscape. So in a way, your turf is a miniature pasture in effect, but it's going to take maintenance, and that's going to be the mowing, the feeding, and the grooming, etc. And it's ornamental too. It's no longer an edible for a livestock. It is a ornamental. And what else would you have there? Well, certainly there are alternatives to turf that we could use too. Perennial peanuts, one of them, mimosa, and a lot of other types of low-growing things. But turf still is king in a lot of places. And people will say, well, it takes a lot of water and nutrients. Well, it's really our doing that. We put all those extra things down, then the grass may not necessarily need that too. We tend to overwater and overfeed. These are what they call warm season turf grasses that we'll talk about. These are the ones that do okay in our area. Centipede grass is probably one you can almost forget because it's really better for northern Florida into Georgia. And I would say, though, that until recently, I could find bags of centipede grass seed in a lot of the box stores. And never say never, because there is an exception to the rule. There's one centipede grass we'll talk about called hammock, and it can grow here. It's adapted for here. So remember I talked about advantages and disadvantages. So here's Bahia grass, which again is a pasture grass turned ornamental. The advantages are if we have a droughty period, it just goes dormant. And it will brown up. In some years, people have even painted it a little bit of green to keep it looking ornamental. It doesn't take as much as nutrients as others, so it's fairly low maintenance. Generally, it's the only one you can start from seed too. And it does like infertile soils, even sandy soils, but it likes acidic soils, and we tend to have alkaline soils. So I guess that's disadvantage mixed in with the advantages there. The disadvantages, if you ever had Bahia grass, sometimes it will put up what they call, little Y-shaped seed heads very quickly, and that can be a bother to some people. Now, technically, if those seed heads were allowed to ripen and the seeds dropped, it would actually reseed itself back into the lawn. So depends how your tolerance for those. It's very open in its growth. It's not a spreading type of thing. It's more of a bunch grass. So weeds will get in. And looking at our office outside, did I say where I am? I'm at my office, not in my bunker. At our office outside here, you can actually see Bahia grass that's been put down somewhat recently, already with weeds in it, because it doesn't have that competition or it can't address the competition like St. Augustine could. Mole crickets is our #1 insect problem, and I would say that in general, that is somewhat faded away. Now, they worked on this problem for pastures, and they also, I think they may have released some predators or parasites or something that helped to suppress mole crickets. So nobody in probably 10 years has brought up mole crickets as a problem, Bahia grass, and residential lawns. So I would say they're there, but they don't seem to be a big problem. Bahia grass is very coarse, so when you mow it, it tends to dull the mower blade very quickly, so you got to keep it sharp. And pretty much all the turf grass we're going to talk about don't like to be played on, walked on, driven on, parked on. They don't tolerate wear very good. Now, something like Bermuda grass, that's one for athletic fields, but these that we're talking about tend to be ones that don't like to be, again, have wear and tear on them. Pensacola is one that you'll find more on the medians inside the roads where they put pallets down after they're finished construction. Again, more of a pasture type, but fine for that purpose. The Argentine is the one that we would prefer, has better color, fewer seed heads, and so it's the turf type that we would say is a better way to go with that. Okay, St. Augustine, probably everybody's somewhat favorite here as far as um, what most people will have in their front yard anyways. It's been around for a lot of years, and it's probably the number one grass, although you will find that what do I want to say? Got my train of thought here. You will find that it is sometimes not favored by northerners because it looks like crabgrass, I guess they say. However, of all the turf grasses, St. Augustine has the best potential for shade tolerance, and we'll talk specifically about which ones have better shade tolerance. Has really good salt tolerance. Now it can tolerate up to 2,000 parts per million salt and water, where everything else is dying in the landscape, but the St. Augustine is actually doing pretty darn well. So it's very good salt tolerance. pH, it's very adaptable to certainly low and medium and a little bit high pH. Very quick establishment, so it's very vigorous and has a good green color. So it can provide that instant lawn, even with plugs and such, pretty quick order. The disadvantages. All right. Here's a term, stolons. Only grows by stolons. So it's only above ground stems or shoots that it spreads from place to place. You know, so that's a good thing too, because it's actually filling in areas and knitting in areas quickly, as opposed to Bahia, which doesn't have that advantage. Not very cold tolerant. And when we had some 23-degree mornings back in 2009 and 10, some St. Augustine lawns actually froze, except for along the edges where they were somewhat shaded. Not very drought tolerant, and that's another problem. They're going to need supplemental watering. So I'm going to say in general, if you don't have an irrigation system, this is probably not a good selection. Not a good wear tolerance type of thing. You don't play on, walk on, drive on, because of, just like Bahia grass, it doesn't tolerate that. It can form excessive thatch. Now, thatch as a definition is dead roots and shoots. It's not grass clippings. And generally thatch that say an inch or less, not a big problem. But an inch or more, and you can see this, you can cut down through the turf and you can see this layer. It's a layer of dead roots and shoots. It's impenetrable by the roots. So the roots actually grow up into it. They don't actually grow into the soil anymore. They can also be a place where chinch bugs and disease can hang out. And if there's an inch or more, we'd recommend not dethatching, but verticutting, where you're actually cutting through that barrier, allowing water and organisms to break that down. And you know, the number one, number two causes of thatch are too much water, too much nitrogen. So again, it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where people feed it too much. There's no chinch bug tolerance. For Floratam used to have a little. They'd said too that I think Captiva had a little bit too, but don't count on that. And we really don't have any herbicides that will control a grassy weed. So say you had common Bermuda grass that popped up in St. Augustine, there's nothing that's going to kill that and not also hurt the St. Augustine. So if we had something like a common Bermuda grass pop up, and it will, I mean, you know, no matter what, you can only defend to the edge of your property. And by seed, by plant part, by accidental, by purpose, some kind of weed's going to come in. And if you get something like common Bermuda grass, you're going to end up, well, it's always best to take care of the problems where they're small. Be monitoring. If you see a patch of weeds, you can simply go and spot treat it with something like Roundup. And then you've done the very least amount of damage. Of course, that may kill some surrounding turf, but then you can go, and in the case of St. Augustine, and just replug it. All right, Floratam, again, it was it's still the bread and butter of St. Augustine's, developed in the 70s. Again, had some chinch bug resistance, and it's one of the standard types that have the normal size. So they have wide leaf blades, wide stolons, and you're mowing it at 3.5 to 4 inches. And that's the height at which it tolerates quite well. Anything below that, you're technically scalping it, and scalping causes stress and decline, and it can even trigger opportunistic diseases to pop in too. These are all the St. Augustine cultivars. Again, if you go to the garden centers these days and you find St. Augustine, I think probably Palmetto is the one that I see most often. I just don't not see any of these others. So some reason Palmetto is the one that's mostly available. But if you go to a sod farm, you can pick what you want. And they will have all these other cultivars. Again, I think Palmetto was touted as being somewhat shade resistant, but that's a relative term too. And we'll talk about that as well. The dwarf cultivars. Now, the dwarf cultivars are technically the ones that would be most shade tolerant. Captiva, Delmar, Sapphire, Seville. And these tend to be ones that are, well, by their very nature, they are dwarf. So you're mowing them at 2 to 2.5 inches, much different. You can see even the size of that piece of dwarf cultivar there. It's much smaller. And shade is a relative term. So if you've got a big tree and grass is not growing underneath it, you could probably try this, but sometimes, dapple shade is one thing. But when you have heavy shade, you may have to just abandon turf as an option and put ground covers in or other plants that are very tolerant of the shade, even some ornamental mulch. But things that would work would potentially be like bromeliads, caladiums, the heliconia, cast iron plant too. And so there's a number of plants that could take be substituted for even shade tolerant grass. But if you're on Jeopardy and they want to know what are dwarf cultivars of Floratam, you'll say, what is Captiva, Delmar, Sapphire, or Seville, Alex? So, okay, you're smiling. I can see that. Alzoysia is your other one, and it's probably third on the list. Empire is the one that really is mostly available. There's other types too. And they're always coming up with new ones. As soon as they find either a cultivar or a mutation that's superior for whatever reason, they're going to put a name on it and market it. And certainly the university has done some of that too, as far as you get patented plants, you get royalties, and of course that helps with funding and such too. But Empire, here's Empire, and interestingly, this is the front yard of a former master gardener. And he liked it so much, he put his whole lawn into it. And it's a very nice looking turf. Whoops, let me go back here. It's very close knit. It has blades of grass that are more reminiscent of northern grasses. Good color. And for some time, it was almost touted as the miracle grass, but it's no such thing. It still has their advantages and disadvantages. So it's very low growing and dense. It tends to take less nitrogen than St. Augustine, so that's a good thing. It takes the same amount of water though. Not very shade tolerant. And we've got a couple of its own little pests here too. Hunting billbug. Hunting billbug is a minute, I think we got a picture later on, a minute weevil that will get into zoysia grass, and it will actually kill little patches, so it looks like it's dying and drying up. It's usually a winter problem. I mean, it's here, and it can be controlled, but that's probably the number one insect pest. And this other one, brown patch, which is really called large patch now, is a fungal disease that will attack zoysia and St. Augustine to a bit too. But it's often triggered by too much nitrogen, and we'll talk about that too. I'm not sure about the nematode tolerance. It can get thatchy again. And again, that may be under our influence, not by its nature. This is I don't have pictures here, but this was a UF release ultimate. And again, they're always trying to find better color, finer texture, faster growth, all these things that will make it more marketable. You can put your name on it, and then, of course, then you can start selling it, by the acre. All right, we talked about centipede grass, and again, you can almost forget this. It's really the standard types. They also call it poor man's grass because it doesn't like to be fertilized very much. Super low growing, prefers acidic, infertile soils. We have the infertile soils taken care of, but we don't have the acidic. We have alkaline soils, so it doesn't like that. By nature, it's very yellow-green in color, so people try to fertilize it to green it up, and that they don't like that. So it's not one that we would say is in favor around here. However, again, the answer to the Jeopardy question is, what is hammock? And hammock is the selected cultivar. I've only seen it in trays before, so you can only get it vegetatively. But it seems to be fine, and it works if you like that type of grass. All right, so it was developed, and again, that's available. What I saw of it looked beautiful, but I don't know exactly where you would find it these days. Again, you'd probably have to go to a sod farm, and there's a number of sod farms around that supply this. Okay, new lawns, what do we do? Well, the first thing is a soil test, and you can see that gentleman has a soil auger, and he's going to take samples, generally 10 to 15 subsamples over the entire area you want tested, upper 6 inches more or less. You want to clear the grass out so that you could get a good soil sample without any weeds or turf in there. You're going to take, again, 10 to 15 subsamples, make a good cup of soil, make sure it's dry. You can use a Ziploc baggie for it. You can download the form from the soil lab. You put in the crop code, and you send it off with $10, and within 2 weeks you get the results back. We get a copy too. Now, the bad news is, I guess, of yesterday, the soil lab is closed. So I don't know if that means that there's going to be a big backup or what. But normally that service is available, and when it comes back, it's a good thing to do. So you're getting your, and I will say too, 2 publications I would give people that answer every question about putting in a new lawn. One is Preparing to Plant a Florida Lawn, and the other one is Establishing a Florida Lawn. And this is more or less what we'll go over with this. So if you're putting in a brand new lawn, of course, it's a time when you have a chance to do everything you can and do it right from the get-go. Irrigation equipment's another thing you need to consider. I'm not an irrigation equipment specialist at all, so you'd have to get a professional in. Often those are certified people that know what they're doing. I guess there's a permit or something to that. So you want to be thinking about that, how that's going to go in, and to put it in then, while you have this raw soil there. It's also a time to add organic matter. And you can see here, 3 to 6 cubic yards per 1,000 square foot is a good thing to do. Now, some places I've seen don't go to all this preparation. They just slap turf on top of the old turf and hope for the best. That's not the best way to go, though. We're going to recommend, again, getting the soil properly prepared to take either the seed or the sod, and you're going to have a lot better take on that. All right, some ways that you could do this: seeding, sodding, or plugs. And the seeding is going to be pretty much relegated just to Bahia grass. Now, with that, there's some special considerations too. You can get Bahia grass seed, but we're going to recommend you get what they call scarified seed. And scarified seed is seed that's been treated so that the seed coat's thinner and germination happens quicker. Because unscarified Bahia seed will take up to 3 weeks to germinate. Now, some will germinate quicker than that too, but to keep it evenly moist for a long time is going to tax you as far as doing this. And in general, we're recommending you're going to be watering 2 or 3 times a day for about 2 weeks to make sure it all gets germinated properly. And that can take a lot of effort. So it's not really a deep watering, it's lighter watering multiple times during the day. You can put seed or sod in any time of the year, but water is really the most important thing to get them going. And again, scarified seed is because it's been treated. I don't know what it costs now, but I remember several years ago somebody bought a bucket of it. I think it was $80, and they put it down, and then a thunderstorm came that night and washed it all away. So be careful with that. And of course, with seeding, again, you're going to be getting the seed bed prepared. You're not putting down in either case sod or seed fertilizer for 30 to 60 days afterwards. They found that the turf is not going to use it, and it may become non-point source pollution where it leaches through, and so it's sort of a waste. So 30 to 60 days after you put it down, then you can put that in. Now, vegetative planting, sodding, you can have instant lawns, of course, whether it's St. Augustine, or you can get Bahia sod too, of course. But the most important thing is keeping it moist, because it's already stressed out. You can see they're going to come in different size sheets of sorts. Some are bigger than others, but that comes with a little bit of soil, a little bit of too. And another reason they don't want fertilizer put down is there's already nutrients in there, and the roots are cut. So they're not going to take up a lot. It's expensive, but it does give you an instant lawn if that's the way you want to go. But with all, certainly, putting in a new lawn, whether you do seed or sod, it's all going to be expensive. It's going to be labor intensive. So you want to keep that in mind. You don't want to be enslaved to your lawn either. But again, when you put this down for 7 days, little spritzes of water 2 or 3 times during the day, especially when you're doing it. It's pretty warm outside, so evaporation is going to occur. And you've got to keep those sod pieces moist so that they will actually root down as quickly as possible. And you can get plugs. Now I see where they come in trays, and I call them turf muffins, because they're all just like little muffins, and they come out of the tray. Generally, depending on how quickly you want them to come together, and this would be for St. Augustine primarily, you would put them about, depending, 6 to 12 inches apart. All right, so turf muffins, I think, was where I was last. Or you could just take and make pretty much like a 3 or 4 inch plug. There are tools to cut a piece of sod into those plugs. And again, St. Augustine, this is going to work the best with. So while you might have had sod that would have cost a lot to put over an area, those will quickly fill in with the plug pieces. Okay, some things we know about irrigation during establishment. You want those frequent light waterings, and it's going to depend on the weather, really. But you don't want that new sod, or plugs or whatever, to begin to wilt. So you're going to have to baby it a bit, and hopefully your irrigation system will take care of that. You can probably even set it up to time for that. And you don't want to overwater either, though. That can be an issue as well. So you're going to continue this for, we'll say, up to 10 days until those roots are well established into the soil. And then we can begin to sort of dial back. So we've had it on this more frequent watering, and then we're going to begin to reduce it to get back to what we would normally provide. And so this is sort of a variable step, but you've got to move it from that to what we're looking at. And this could take, the transition could take another week or two, depending. So establishment time is going to be several weeks. And we don't want that water to stop because it's so fragile at that point. As I mentioned, you want to wait 30 to 60 days after seeding or putting the sod down to put fertilizer down. And we'll talk about fertilizer more in a bit here. So they don't really need a lot till that 30 to 60 days afterwards. Water is the most important thing. The first mowing, well, you don't want to pick up your newly plugged sod or even seedlings too early, when that could get very damaged by something as simple as a mower blade, where it could actually pull up if it was sod, the pieces, and of course that would not be good. Then there's the question of renovation. And at what point do you say that a turf is no longer usable, it's not ornamental? It may not even have any recognizable turf in it. Now, my front yard anyways, has multiple personality disorder. So it's got Bahia grass, it's got St. Augustine, it's got some Comber Bermuda, and it's got other stuff too. And it's sort of like watching coral fight. One time of the year, the St. Augustine's winning. Another time of the year, the Comber Bermuda's winning. So I don't really put much into my turf personally because I just don't have time. But if I found that more than 50% of it had weeds or other problems, or no turf at all, then I may consider renovation. And generally, it might be as severe as a complete do-over. Some people have had turf that, again, they would ask me, what turf do I have? I thought, there's nothing recognizable there. It's all weeds and weedy grasses, which, is fine to a lot of people too. So I don't want to push this necessarily. But if more than 50% of it was weeds, or if there's no recognizable turf, then you would probably go ahead and do some kind of a total kill with a Roundup. And again, you might do this in sections and not one giant piece. But that's a decision people have to make. And sometimes it's a good time to start introducing Florida-friendly landscaping features as well, where you might say, well, maybe in this area wasn't doing good because you had nematode issues. Well, let's try something that's more nematode resistant as a ground cover in this area. So you might mix and match and still have some turf cover, but you might also have a variety of other types of ground covers that you could use. All right, now in comes and we'll go another 5 minutes, we'll take a break. In comes the thing called the fertilizer ordinance, and it came about in 2008, and it limited the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus you could put down. It limited when you could put it down, and it also brought about, for commercial people, the need to take what they call green industry best management practices training. And up till now, we've been offering it monthly here. People that do it commercially have to take this course. They have to get a 75% or better, and then they have to get a state license. So it's almost regulated like a pesticide now. Homeowners still have to follow the ordinance, but there's no push on or mandated training. We try to, instill it into everybody as we can. So best management practices we're looking for is clean water and a healthy landscape. And here's what they call a biobasin. It's a swale where water is collected, it's settled up, and it then percolates slowly down into the water table and the aquifers. But with a place like that's covered with turf, we know that the turf is going to do a pretty good job, as the best job of the plants we have, to actually do that cleaning of the water. Now, if you were here present, I would give you our blue brochure, it is on our website though. And it's just at a glance, what does the ordinance say? Now, one part of it was phosphorus. Now, they limit the amount of phosphorus to 1/4 pound per 1,000 square foot per application, or a 1/2 pound total for the for the whole year for 1,000 square foot. So perfectly reasonable. If I think I'll be showing you a example of that, but our soil tests come back generally. All our soils are very high in phosphorus already. We already live on it, so understandable. If your soil test came back and said you are deficient in phosphorus, then that's your documentation. You could add more, but generally 0 phosphorus is a good number to go. The fertilizer ordinance also requires that you use a 50% slow release nitrogen product. It was very difficult to find at times. Some places had it, like Site 1, which used to be called John Deere, which used to be called Lesco, had it. But now, most of the box stores, you can find a 50% slow release product. We'll show you how to find out if you've got, well, how to pick one out at the market. We also have a fertilizer-free zone requirement near any body of water, unless you have a deflector shield on your spreader. And of course, the spreader is going to shoot out the fertilizer granules, and the deflector kicks that back away from the body of water or anywhere that you don't want to get fertilizer on. Now, the 50% slow release fertilizer, slow release nitrogen fertilizer, going back for a minute, tends to be more expensive because it's been formulated, encapsulated, or processed so that instead of a big shot of nitrogen, which quick release would do, which would be here and gone in about 30 days, this has, it ticks off just a little bit of fertilizer, nitrogen rather, over a longer period of time. Generally, it's going to be months potentially too, depending on the type you get. Some common sense things on this ordinance: all fertilizer and grass clippings should be swept off impervious surfaces, because grass clippings and fertilizer are going to become what they call non-point source pollution. Oops. And you can see right here, here's a storm drain down at the bottom, and that's grass clippings. The grass clippings are full of nitrogen, and they're going to end up into that storm drain and out into the water sources, so that's not cool. All applicators of fertilizer, as I mentioned, have to take the best management training. Okay, I'm going to skip that. I'm going to show you some other stuff in a minute. Now, 2008, we had a certain ordinance. It did not have a restricted season or a nitrogen limit. And in 2011, I think it was, we had a new piece in there. It's the restricted season. It's when you can put no nitrogen and no phosphorus down June 1st to September 30th. And it sort of is in counter to science when the turf could use it the best, but this is the ordinance that we follow. You can use, however, what they call a summer blend. A summer blend like a 0024. So it's got no nitrogen, no phosphorus, but it does have potassium, which is very good for turf and other plants because it helps it to take stress better. It's also got magnesium, sulfur, iron. So there's other things in it, micronutrients, that will help, and you can put that down during that period. Okay, we talked about the phosphorus rule, and that makes sense as far as limits to the amount you can put down. I would say you don't need any phosphorus in general. Here you go. Here's an example with the soil test results here. This is for acid-loving plants, and the pH, looking right here, is 6.1. So that's pretty good for our area. Most of our pHs are going to be 7.6 to 7.8. You remember with Stephen Brown with the 0 to 14, 7 is neutral. The pH is very important as far as availability of nutrients. But look at this, phosphorus, and you can see it's very high at least. So anything with a 0 in a formulation for turf example, a 15-0-15, a 14-0-26, that type of thing can be used. So just an example of that. Why do we don't need phosphorus? We have a limit to 4 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square foot per year. We're putting it down up to 1 pound per 1,000 square foot per application. This is fine too, because most of our, well, at least turf grasses, and a lot of this is for turf grasses too, they can take, like, for example, Bahia grass, 2 to 4 pounds per year. St. Augustine, 4 pounds. Zoysia, probably 2 to 4, somewhere in that range too. So that's perfectly good. I tell you what, I want to give you a break. So let's start back in 10 minutes. So go take a bio break, as they call it. And I'm going to go take a bio break. And we'll see you back in 10 minutes. Good?
Okay.
Okay, let's start again, I guess. Hands up if you can hear me. Okay, beautiful. All right. This picture just shows a place that has what they call a lot of impervious surfaces. You've got stormwater drains, you got asphalt, you got sidewalks. This is actually the parking lot for the Sarasota Extension Service. So this was probably a very difficult place to put any fertilizer down because of all these little targets. And so some places you want to be very careful to be putting fertilizer down, of course. Within the ordinance, there's this thing that says, in no case shall grass clippings, vegetative material, and/or vegetative debris, either intentionally or accidentally, be deposited or discharged in the stormwater drains, ditches, conveyances, water bodies, or roadways. Well, here's I guess you could call a swale right here. And a swale, I suppose, would be considered a ditch or a stormwater drain to a degree. Certainly these grass clippings here would be a violation, and people should be aware of that, whether they're homeowners or commercial people. They should at least blow them back up into the swale. Now, technically, on one side, we should keep the grass clippings out of here. However, because we want to return grass clippings because they have nutrients in them to turf, we want to maintain the integrity of the swale too. Actually had a gentleman call the commissioners. He had a ride-on mower, and he couldn't get all the grass clippings, he said, out of the swale. So they asked us, they said, what's humanly possible? I mean, even the county often doesn't do a good job as far as, seeing grass clippings out here. So you do your best you can. In some places, like here, this is probably somewhat downhill. Maybe the water flows a little bit. But places that are directly connected to bodies of water are going to be more sensitive areas where you want to be careful about fertilizing and trying to keep nutrients out of those bodies of water. All right, we talked about the fertilizer-free zone where, well, this is a seawall of sorts, and this would be, this is in the ordinance, but it's a voluntary thing. It's not mandatory, but it's suggested that you might have, say, a 6-foot to 10-foot zone here of appropriate plants. Definitely doesn't mean to have palm trees here because we don't want the integrity of the seawall to get messed up. But some place where you don't have to mow, you don't have to fertilize, and it acts as a interceptor and cleaner of any water that goes through and over into the actual body of water. Okay, so that's that. I'm just going to skip through that. Okay, irrigation. Now, irrigation is super important because of the cost of water. We don't want to overwater things. Of course, that can cause problems too. And things like the time of day, and even also that things like rain shut-off devices are mandated by law that they should be operational. And how many people have seen irrigation going off in the middle of rainstorms? Happens often. And generally, with short, frequent irrigation, with short, frequent irrigations, you tend to have more shallow roots versus longer, less frequent. Well, in general, we want to have our water go down probably 6 to 8 inches, and that's where most of the roots are going to be. And that's generally going to be, and we'll repeat this many times, between 1/2 and 3/4 of an inch of water per irrigation. An inch of water can go 12 inches down, which often is well beyond the roots, and it may also wash nutrients past the roots too, and then that can become. How often to water? Well, grass will tell you, but often it's telling you in the worst possible time, usually midday or in the afternoon when you can't do much about it. But things like, here's a grass blade that's folding in half, that's a sign. Or if you walk on the grass and the footprints remain, they don't spring back, that's another sign. And they may just have a general bluish cast to them too that indicates that they are suffering from drought stress. And then with irrigation, you've got to make sure you're getting proper distribution. Now here, you can see that there's some places getting more water than others. We want is that even one, and that's going to take some calibration and adjusting. You know, certainly when the irrigation system is put in, but also when you may have to do a little fine tuning or again calibration. And here's how you could do that. You put down catch cups. Now you can use tuna fish cans or whatever you need to do it. You put them, you put them down at regular intervals, and then you let the irrigation system go for a period of time. You want your goal is between 1/2 inch and 3/4 of an inch of water put down per irrigation event. And most of the places, you know, around us are going to allow twice a week, depending on your number. During drought times, they may reduce it to once. And sometimes during the winter, once a week is sufficient. And there may be even times when you can skip a week too. But this type of thing with the catch cups, it will allow you then to measure how much water is getting in those areas. And then you can calibrate and adjust as necessary, whether it's to replace heads or add additional heads to it. Again, I'm not an irrigation specialist, but this all makes sense, especially when you're looking at a lawn and you're seeing brown spots or some other issues. It may be just the amount of water is not getting to where they should go. Of course, some things are just, you know, socially unacceptable. You know, hitting the wall here, not working. So as soon as possible, people need to take care of those issues because it's wasting water. All right, so as I've been mentioning, 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch, that will get down through the root zone, but it doesn't allow, you know, to excess where you'll have water that will be wasted or that washes nutrients like nitrogen. Nitrogen is very mobile in the soil. Matter of fact, when we do the soil test, we can't look for nitrogen in the test because it's here and gone in very short time. It can leach down through if it's not picked up by turf roots or other roots. You can test for nitrogen using a tissue test. We actually take the grass blade tissue and you have that tested, but that's the only accurate way. But again, with watering, you don't want to overwater it. Again, it costs money. Time of day. When grass is wet, it can get, it's more likely to get disease entering into it. And so we want to have the grass dry out as quickly as possible so the dew doesn't hang on it, you know, and we're in control as much as we can of our artificial if it rains at night or, you know, some other time, we can't really control that. So the best time to water is just before or at sunrise. And that's going to give you time for the water to get in and for it to dry off quick enough before it goes into the heat of the day. Okay, feeding your lawn. This is a whole nother piece here that's important. You know, some people don't ever feed their lawn, and it does fine to a degree there. But generally, by feeding lawns, you know, as allowed by the ordinances and properly done, it will benefit the turf because it will then be able to outcompete things like diseases and pests. And we got to look at the fertilizer bag here. This is just a typical one. You can see it's a 15% nitrogen, no phosphorus. That's good. And 50% potassium. There's other things in it too that aren't, visible from this piece here, just the 15015. There's also calcium, magnesium, sulfur, some boron in there. So there's other nutrients which are generally going to be micronutrients that will be on that label. And this is what they call the guaranteed analysis. This is what's in that pack of fertilizer. So we'll take you through, and again, keeping in mind, I hate to do math in public, so hopefully I don't have to do it more than once here. But how would you know if your fertilizer is a 50% slow release fertilizer? Well, I've only seen one bag of fertilizer recently that actually says on the front that it is 50%. Otherwise, you got to flip it over and look at the guaranteed analysis. So here it is for a 14026, 14% nitrogen, no phosphorus, 26% potassium. And, if you were, another way to look at it, if this was a 100-pound bag, there'd be 14 pounds of nitrogen, no phosphorus, 26 pounds of potassium, and other stuff too. But we want to know, is this a 50% slow release product? Should we buy it in the first place? And we're looking at the nitrogen. Well, there it is right there. But you got to look all the way down to the bottom of the label. Sensitive buttons. To the bottom of the label here to see that 7% is slowly available. So so we know that 7 is actually, half of 14. Or you could take 14, divide it into 7 times 100. So that's 50%. So we know that this particular, without it saying anything else on the label, and some of them may say it, but this is a 50% slow release product. So it is, as per the ordinance, okay to use. Does that make sense? Head shaking up and down?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. See, Liz, go ahead. I'm going to go with that. But, as we go through this, and we're still using this, the example of this fertilizer 14026, and when I say, we talked about 15, let's see. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. 15015 or a 14026 or its equivalent, because there's a lot of times you can just say or its equivalent. These are all fine fertilizers you could use as mostly for turf, though. All right. So we know that we have a 50% slow release. We've already determined that. So that's check number 1. The next check is how much do we need to put into our spreader to actually deliver the proper amount. And what we're going to be looking at is we want to deliver 1 pound of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square foot per application. So how do you do that? Let me show you. All right. So we're still working with our 14026. So again, we're paying attention to the 14% nitrogen. And what we do is we put divide 14 to 100. That gives us 7.14 pounds. That's 7.14 pounds of the complete 14026. We put that into our spreader. We walk 1,000 square foot. And as a result of that, we will have delivered 1 actual pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square foot. Now, we know it's 50% slow release. We know how much now to put in the bin, but is your spreader actually doing that? You may have to calibrate it. And ways to do that would be probably the simplest is put a tarp down of so many hundreds or thousands square foot, and then walk it and see if when you weigh it, if you're actually getting that. And not only is it the weight of it, but also look how the granules are spread apart. We don't want bands. We don't want big bunches of fertilizer that are dumped out. We want it evenly broadcast over that area. But once we know what 1,000 square foot unit is, then again, if we had a bigger thing like a 4,000 square foot, we'd need 28.56 pounds of fertilizer, of the complete fertilizer, the 14026, to put down and actually cover the 4,000 square foot. And for every 1,000 square foot, we put down 7.14 pounds. Now, does this make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Heads going up and down?
Yeah.
Pretty good? Okay. So that's just the simple part. The calibration, though, is going to be the other part where you are tweaking your spreader to make sure you're actually putting that down. For mowing, we don't want to mow wet grass because that's going to mess up the mower. We want to do it at the highest rate. Remember, we're talking about 3.5 to 4 inches for like St. Augustine and Bahia grass. And we want to keep the mower blades sharp. And again, that's a cultural practice. But if you have a mower blade that's dull, it's going to shatter the grass blades, and it's not going to look good. And it's also going to have more surface area for organisms to get in and cause damage to the particular grass. So rule of thumb is going to be no more than 1/3 of the blade at any one time. Leave the grass clippings on the ground. Remember, grass clippings don't contribute to thatch. Thatch are dead roots and shoots, and they're generally going to be because we fed too much nitrogen and too much water, and that's the resulting problem. So we leave the clippings on the ground. I've seen different figures, but I'm going to say between 25 and 30% of the nutrients can be returned simply by leaving them on the grass. Now, if we have a very shaded condition or we have drought, we'll make sure to have something to reduce the stress on the turf. So we're going to have it at the highest mowing height that we can. We're not going to leave any of the grass clippings, of course, on roadways or sidewalks, because that could become what they call non-point source pollution, where it gets mixed in with the storm water and can then contribute to what they call impaired waters, where impaired waters may have too much nitrogen or too much phosphorus, and that's when you have all types of algae problems and fish die-offs, etc. Okay. This is just an interesting illustration here showing the mowing and how intense something might get culturally and how it affects the roots and shoots. So on this end, we have a golf green, and they're probably using Bermuda, some selected super fancy Bermuda grass here, but they keep it really low, and the roots are also low. So it's really artificially kept. But if you've ever seen a golf green that looks like the top of a pool table, you say, I don't even know if this is alive anymore. But it's managed. That particular turf, the Bermuda, can take that, and so it exists. But of course, as we get, we'll say, to a lawn, it's much higher. Of course, we're looking mostly at 3.5 to 4 inches, and you tend to get a balance to some degree of roots and shoots. And of course, then you get medians and rights of way where it's barely, or should I say, not regularly mowed, a much less cultural intensity here, much deeper roots, and really good shoots too. We've gone sort of over this too a bit. The St. Augustine, 3.5 to 4 inches. The dwarf St. Augustines, that remember are more adapted to shade, 2 to 2.5, again, because they are dwarfs. Bahia grass, 3 to 4 inches, and zoysia grass, about 2 to 2.5, we'll say. All right, here's a problem that occurs sometimes purposely and sometimes accidentally, scalping, where people have mowed way too low, and it really hurts the grass. I mean, it is a definite stress, and stress to turf causes disease and decline and such. Say that you had St. Augustine that you should have mowed at 3.5 to 4 inches, and you've mowed it to 2 inches. Not only now is the turf going to have to use its resources that it's stored as carbohydrates in its tissue to regrow itself, that's going to stress it out. Because not only do the blades make food, they store food. And as an example, if somebody comes in and they have a problem with their turf, and I ask them the mowing height, and if they tell me 2 inches, I said, well, you're the problem. And there's a disease we'll talk about later called take-all root rot that can occur during the summer during heavy rains, but one of the triggers is low mowing. And when you low mow, you stress the grass out. And sometimes plants in general, if they're stressed, things that ordinarily wouldn't hurt them, hurt them. And this take-all root rot is already present on the roots, and then it overwhelms the stressed grass. But we'll talk about that later. Again, don't scalp. All right, we're getting into some pests now here. And these are going to be insect pests as far as beginning. And some are very common, and some are probably less of an issue. But chinch bugs are probably one of your #1 problems on St. Augustine. And they actually exist. You can see them. They're probably around the size of a grain of rice. They're visible, but so many people, I think, believe where they'll have pest control companies say, I think you got chinch bugs. Well, did you check? Well, no. Can you show me? No, and I've heard people have shown me things that they thought were chinch bugs, which weren't. So to know them is very helpful. Grubs are also a problem in St. Augustine grass to a degree, and they're the larvae of scarab beetles. And then mole crickets and bahia, again, as I mentioned, they don't seem to be as big of a problem as they were a number of years ago. So something's going on that's suppressing that pest, which is a good thing. All right, the southern chinch bug. And you can see here, here are the nymphs. Now these have gradual metamorphosis or incomplete, where they hatch out, and then the young or the nymphs look just like the adults minus the wings, and they also can't reproduce at that point. The young ones are sort of an orange and white striped. Again, these are minute. Even this one's probably going to be the size of a grain of rice. This is an immature one. You can see the wing buds right there. But these are little, but they are visible. You can see them with the naked eye. They'll start crawling about, and there's other ways you can start sort of scouting for them too. So they live in the thatch and the grass leaf sheaths. St. Augustine's the primary one. So if you're sick of chinch bugs, change turf and you won't have this. So some of the life cycle here. One generation, about every 6 weeks. The warmer it is, the better they do. I'll also mention, too, the more nitrogen you use on the turf, the better off the chinch bugs are. So keep that in mind that sometimes we're the cause of some of this. They can lay a lot of eggs and have many generations. As I mentioned, they sometimes hang out in the thatch. And they like to hang together. They like to be a group. Generally, when you find some damage of it, it looks like drought damage, and then they keep expanding as a group further and further out. So there's dead areas, then there's sort of yellow areas, and then there's green, and they begin to work out from a center blotch, more or less. But they do develop quicker when it's warmer. So you want to make sure you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, too. Here's the chinch bug. Here's the false chinch bug, and I don't know why, I think they're just a minor problem, but this is the good guy, the big eye bug. The big eye bug is a predator of chinch bugs, and they look sort of the same, at a glance. These are all true bugs. They have sucking, piercing mouth parts, but while these feed on plants, this one feeds on chinch bugs and other such creatures. And there may be sufficient big eye bugs to control chinch bugs in your turf year-round, potentially. But there's thresholds we'll talk about at what point and how many chinch bugs you need to take an action. But you definitely you want to preserve these as much as possible. So that's a good guy. So here's the stages, as I mentioned. This is a sort of a gradual metamorphosis. They hatch out and they go from different nymph stages here. As you can see, they get some little wing buds and a little bit bigger. And then finally, here's the mature adult, which can breed and reproduce. So what's the damage look like? As I mentioned, it looks like drought damage. And sometimes they've come and gone before you've been able to do anything to. So there's going to be dead areas. This is probably a better picture here where there's some dead and some yellowing, sort of blotchy looking areas, ever expanding. But you really need to get down on your hands and knees to examine it and to find the infestation. So it may look like a lot of other things. It could look like nematodes. It could look like root rots and such. So you've got to look a little further to see if there actually are chinch bugs there that you need to deal with. So what do? Well, you got to get on your hands and knees and start looking around on the grass. And I've had people bring samples in boxes, and the chinch bugs were crawling out of the box. But they are there. They may try to avoid you. They may try to drop off the plant. And there are ways, too, of getting them to come up a little bit more. Again, here's the ultimate, where you're sort of shading the area, getting really close and personal. There have been other ways, too, where you could used to put metal coffee cans, and they would push them into the soil and pour water in, and then the chinch bugs would float to the surface. There's other ways. There's actually soap flushes you can put down. A lot of these insects don't like soap, so they will, well, here they're talking about using the soap flush, putting it down, and then the chinch bugs will pop up, and then you can count them. And to know the number of chinch bugs in a square foot is your ultimate goal. Generally, 20 to 25 chinch bugs per square foot is the trigger point. Anything less than that, the turf can most likely bear it. And also, it can, something else is going to be feeding on them. Might be big eye bugs or other predators. But some, you can have infestations where there's 2,000 chinch bugs per square foot, and you'll see them, very obvious. But there's always going to be some chinch bugs in healthy grass. It's not there's no need to take the nuclear option until you've got that 20 to 25 per square foot. Things to do, cultural practices are always preferred over chemical if at all possible. And, again, with them, we want to conserve the natural enemies like the big eye bugs. We want to try to reduce the nitrogen too a bit. Well, keep the nitrogen at the proper level. Don't overfeed with it. Sometimes too, and again, people didn't realize this till it was too late. They were using the same pesticide over and over and over again until the chinch bug became resistant to it. So we'll talk about that too. We want to try to reduce the thatch. Again, not too much nitrogen, not too much water. And we want to be careful, again, not to make the turf tastier for the chinch bugs. And again, too much nitrogen can cause that to occur. It just, the chinch bugs do better, and they grow faster. And so sort of that's on us. So we want to be careful with that. All right. If you had to go the insecticide way, and of course some companies will come through and, on a calendar route, they will put down things to prevent them. But we'd like to use the integrated pest management, where you identify the pest. Is it a pest? Are there sufficient numbers to warrant a treatment? And once you cross that threshold, then what do you do? And there's a number of things to do. Generally, though, we can spot treat this with like a 5-foot buffer around to control chinch bugs. Now, I talked about resistance. Here's a little history on the resistance of certain chemicals within the chinch bug population. So, and we can't use certainly chlordane anymore, but they became resistant in '53, DDT in 1957, and then all these other things, which are Dursban and diazonon's off the market. Dialox is still on. But the last one was Talstar. It's a synthetic pyrethroid, and they became resistant to that because people used it over and over again. They didn't change. And the genetics of the chinch bug were able to adapt. The first population they applied pesticides to, maybe 98% of them died. But those two that survived had superior genetics. They were able to override it, and for long, all the populations were resistant. And these are just some places where there are pyrethroid resistant chinch bugs. And so what do you do about that? Well, you rotate. You don't use the same chemical family or the same mode of action repeatedly. You sort of mix it up in that way that you can, to the best of your ability, not add to the resistance issue. I've heard that if you get 80% control of chinch bugs, you're doing pretty good. But rotation of the, again, chemical families is the way to do that. And often on the labels, they will tell you about that. There's some specific ones about that. Again, this is just a thing on proper pesticide usage and also some cultural stuff. But when it comes to pesticides, and we'll do a whole separate training on that, you want to read the label because the label's the law. Here are some chemicals that are available, but you rotate them. And sometimes there may be combination chemicals in here too, so they work a little bit better. But you got to make sure that the pest chinch bug is on it and that it's okay to apply to your St. Augustine turf in this case. And you're going to go from there. But remember, again, spot treat with about a 5-foot buffer around it is the best way to limit the application and also, in a way, spot treat. So IPM is the way to go. Again, there's a number of chemicals can be used. Be careful again about nitrogen because that can make things grow a lot better. And beyond the big eye bug, there's some other parasites and beneficials that are probably feeding on the chinch bugs as well. So you don't want to get rid of those tools that are already helping you. So, you know, if life gives you lemons, make lemonade. If life gives you chinch bugs, then change grasses. And generally, the Zoysia, Bahia, Bermuda, they won't attack quite as badly, if at all. And so those would be ones to avoid any chinch bug issues in the first place. Okay, so probably chinch bugs are number one complaint around here. Number two is probably white grubs. The white grubs are just the larvae of scarab beetles. This one right here in the lower left is the sugarcane grub. And this was accidentally introduced from around Lake Okeechobee because it really was a sugarcane pest. And I think soil that came from that area for fill came into Charlotte County and introduced this problem. It's an enormous larva. It's probably 3.5 inches. The beetle's pretty good size too. It not only was affecting St. Augustine grass, but it started getting into ornamentals like Fachahachie and some muley grass. They even did some studies around where they had one of them, our master gardeners, was trapping the beetles for them, and they were trying to figure out what's the best way to control these. They certainly are big, and they tend to be deep in the soil, so it's hard to kill them. They seem to have mellowed out. I just don't hear as much problem anymore with that. This is a green June beetle, the one here on the right. It is, you've probably seen the adult beetles. They're almost a metallic green color. This one is pretty good size, probably 2.5 to 3 inches, but its main trivial thing about it is it moves on its back. It doesn't move around on its legs. It sort of squirms like a snake on its back here. But in general, most of our scarab beetles are not a problem. They're not pests. But for those that are pests, their main problem is they feed on the roots of the grass. So there's a lot of them around. Most of them are annual, though. They'll go from egg to adult in a year. Here's the eggs. You can see here's a penny, so you can see how big or how little they are. Generally, the adult is going to be laying these eggs June, July. So it's sort of a fuzzy window time there, but that's when they're going to be laid. They'll be hatching out during that time. The larvae then are small, close to the surface, and easier to kill. So generally our control window is going to be June, July in that point of time. Here's the pupa and then finally the adult. And again, it depends on the type of beetle, how quickly they go from egg to adult, and as far as overwintering to the next generation. And what we'd recommend is you make a 3-sided square foot cut on a piece of turf. You dig down a couple inches and you peel that flap back and you count the amount of grubs. Depending on your setting, probably 6 or 7 grubs per square foot is going to be your trigger point, of which point you would want to then take an action. Now, if you're a golf green, you're going to take an action with maybe 1 grub because you don't want any blemishes on that. But most of our residential turf can take 6 or 7 grubs per square foot without causing a big problem. Now, I threw this in here because it's interesting, and there's a lot of things that have changed, of course, too. These are what they call Typhoid or Scoliid wasps, and they're known as white grub hunters or scarab hunters. And I think this is a male here, and these males will come out in the hundreds, and they'll get on shrubs and bushes because they're waiting for the females to come out. But if you see, sometimes people will call up and they see these manifestations of all these males, and they don't sting, which is interesting because they're males, but they can scare people because it looks like a swarm of yellow jackets almost. But the female will actually look for a white grub, and it listens for it, I guess. Sometimes how it detects it. It will then dig down to where the grub is. It will sting it. And some paralyze them temporarily. Some paralyze them for the rest of their short life. And they lay an egg on them. The egg hatches, and the larva then feeds on the living host. Sort of gruesome, but it's a good way to get rid of some of your grubs there. So the Typhoid and Scoliid wasps, if you see them, they're doing some good work for you there too. This flower they're on is the Lara flower, which was being touted and promoted several years ago because they love the nectar of it. It actually attracted them into your yard. Unfortunately, now they found this flower, this plant, the Lara flower, is now a Category 2 invasive, so we're not.
Oh.
You probably got them anyways. Other things that feed on grubs, of course, ants and birds and armadillos and moles. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. There is the southern Lara flower, or the shrubby false buttonweed. Again, it's a Category 2 invasive. Wasn't that beautiful looking anyway? So, but I'm sure it's out there somewhere, attracting wasps. So, what do you do chemically if you found you had to do that? And generally, I don't find a lot of people have this problem. Again, pest control companies may put this down historically, but probably as a preventative, the Merit or imidacloprid is probably the one most people would use. It has some residual activity, so you're putting it down in that June, July window of opportunity. It kills the grubs when they're small. The curative, you can use Dilox, or people are familiar with Sevin or Carbaryl. That can be put down generally in the August, September time. But by that time, the grubs have done their damage, and I think it's just sort of a waste of time at that point. Now, interesting. The beneficial nematodes. There are nematodes that naturally exist, or you can buy them, that will get in and kill white grubs. And of course, these are microscopic roundworms, very, very tiny, and they're fragile too. They got to keep moist at a certain temperature, but commercially in some places, they are applied as a pesticide, so to speak. And what it does is it gets into the white grub through its mouth, its rear end, or its breathing apparatus. It has bacteria in its mouth that it releases. It kills the host, which is the white grub, and then the bacteria just proliferate, and the nematodes feed on the bacteria, and then they reproduce and scatter and look for some more hosts. So they're sort of, again, another tool that you could use, but they're a bit fragile, but they are available commercially. So for white grubs, June, July is the time to try to hit them. Again, the sugarcane grub, I couldn't tell you if that, I've not seen as many in the last 5 years as I had seen before. So that may be a bygone problem. Maybe it's being suppressed by something else. And the nematodes, again, are an interesting tool. You can buy them, and you look, you say, well, I just purchased, 10 million beneficial nematodes, and they fill in the size of a stamp, and they're very fragile, and the temperature has to be so, but they can be used. But don't plant a lariflora because they are category 2 invasive, and there's probably some out there now, but they are a noted scarab hunter wasp attractant. Now let me talk about moles, because people always get messed up about moles here too. The moles aren't rodents, and they don't feed on plant materials. They're insectivores. They have to eat up to 85% of their weight every day in food. You know what their number one favorite food is? Worms, earthworms, not grubs, although they will eat white grubs. Moles go where it's moist and where it's irrigated. Where is that? It's our lawns. There may be as few as 3 to 5 per acre. They get around a lot, and they tend to, turn the earth over. But in general, unless it's a big problem for you, just live with them. Other than that, you can use those mole traps. They sort of look like a U-shaped thing that you would actually, if you found one of their above ground tunnels, you press it down. If it pops up in 24 hours, it's a good place to put the trap. The trap straddles the tunnel, and when the mole comes through, it triggers a plate that plunges harpoons down through it. You just pick them off one at a time. But I would say in general, they're not a big issue. Although I did have a lady call up and said she feared she would not sell her house because she had moles. And I never heard of such a thing. I tried to convince her and talk her off the ledge. I don't know if she believed me. So moles, again, can be easily tolerated. There is a castor bean repellent that can be put down, but it only lasts as long as it rains. And again, I think with the few moles that we actually ever get, if I can convince you, it's something not to worry about, really. Mole crickets, though, which are going to look sort of like a little mole, and I've had people confusing whether they had mole crickets or moles, but definitely, the moles themselves are about 6 inches or so, and they look really different, and they have much bigger holes. Generally, the moles will they have deep underground tunnels, and they'll push soil up, and it will come into sort of a mound, a cracked mound of loose soil, but they've got to get rid of that excess soil, and that's what they do. And the other ones are just the sinuous above ground tunnels that are near the surface, and that's where they're actually feeding. But the mole crickets also make little tunnels of sorts, and they're well adapted for tunneling and being mole-like. They're actually crickets. They can fly. I think we got one native, and there's at least 2 introduced ones. And if you wanted to meet your friends, this is how you would tell them apart by their thorax and their forelegs. So there's different ways of looking about that, but you don't have to worry about that. Here's some of the tunneling. You can see these little movements through here. And mainly what they do is they feed on the base of the bahia grass. Again, it's a bahia grass problem primarily. Now this is, whoops. This is the Lara wasp, or the scolid or typhid wasp larva, growing and feeding as a parasite on the outside of the mole cricket. So the mole cricket stops doing damage, but it's still alive, and it feeds on it until it's dead. So a gruesome way to go, but definitely one of those tools in our toolkit that we can use to suppress this pest. here's the nematodes. Now, although they're microscopic, I don't know how they get these pictures, but all these little wiggly lines here, whoops, are the parasitic nematodes. So they go in, they release the bacteria, they kill the host, they feed on the bacteria, and then they scatter to looking for the next host. So really good way to control things. Chemical controls, there's lots of different ones, but again, I'm going to say that nobody's brought the grass and mole cricket problems to me in years. There are baits, though. Sometimes that's a convenient way to go. You will see these that will fly to lights at night, especially the males. And so just for your information, really not a big threat at this point. Now, nematodes, which we'll have a separate talk about, are those microscopic worms. They have a stylus or a pin-like mouth part that punctures the roots. Now, there are some that go inside the root and some that feed outside. Root knot ones would be an example. And they can cause sufficient damage in turf to be noticeable. And if they're doing damage, what can we do? Well, there are, and Dr. Crow, Billy Crow's the nematologist, he's done studies on different types of naturally derived nematode suppressant materials that can be applied. I think the homeowner can get them too. But generally they found by adding soil amendments, and that may be difficult with turf, but soil amendments like compost seems to have predators and parasites of nematodes that control them to some degree. If nematodes are causing damage, we can, of course, water better and feed better. Bahia grass is going to be generally, nematode-free or tolerant, so that's not so much an issue. It's pretty much St. Augustine grass is going to cause the problem with that. And, and what you would do is have a nematode assay or test, and then it will tell you from your test results the type of nematodes, are they damaging, and the concentration. And then, then you can figure out, is it worthwhile doing anything about it? Sometimes people will possibly abandon parts or tracts of turf for the purpose of trying something else, perennial peanut, mimosa, or some other ground cover that is more nematode resistant. So there are ways to get around them, but in our sandy soil, they do very well, and I'm sure you've seen them in other things like vegetables and such. Ooh, that looks way too much like a coronavirus there. Let me cough at that for a second. We can finish up here. So I think we can finish up here, and then we can look at the chat, and we can go over things at some of the diseases. And I would say with diseases, they're more difficult to positively identify because of their need sometimes to go to the plant pathology lab. And I think it's $40 now. You can send a sample over to them in Gainesville, and they will do a good analysis and some recommendations. But sometimes $40 is not worth it. Anyways, with one of the least problematic diseases, if you want to call it, are fairy rings. You may have seen these during the summer. We have a lot of rain, it's hot. You'll get rings of mushrooms developing. And generally, they're feeding on underground organic matter. It might be construction wood left there or dead roots from a tree. Some of these fairy rings actually release nitrogen at the ring and cause it to be darker than the surrounding grass. Sometimes, too, the activity of the fairy ring will make the soil there hydrophobic. Water won't soak into it, and so it makes it a little bit dry there. But in general, these are, temporary. Some people may even put down some fertilizer to cover the color difference here. Certainly, you could mow over it. It's really not a big problem. However, the actual fairy ring mushrooms sometimes are very poisonous, like the death angel type ones there. So you don't want kids or pets getting into them. As the organic matter underground breaks down, it will eventually go away. So I would say that's probably the least problematic disease. Probably the most common is the take-all root rot on St. Augustine. So when we have heavy rains in July and August, coupled with, as I mentioned, people scalping their lawns, sometimes this gets triggered. And it starts out as sort of yellowish patches because the roots are starting to die. Now, it's interesting, the take-all root rot fungal organism lives on the roots of all warm season grasses. So normally it's there and it doesn't hurt it. But as soon as that grass gets stressed, again, sometimes scalping will trigger that, it begins to overwhelm the grass and kills it, rots the roots. And then you get large areas, or small, it depends, of yellowing and then browning damage. There are chemicals to stop it, maybe even prevent it. But the thing is, you can go right back in soon after and replug, because the plugs you got already have the disease in it, but it's not a disease until the grass gets stressed. So these are some of the chemicals. This is what the roots look like. But I would say that one thing is prevention, and just don't scalp it. Pythium root rot is somewhat similar. It occurs during the same time. But you can see, you see these spots, and unless you actually took it and had a lab analysis on it, you're somewhat speculating at what it is. I guess the good news is a lot of these fungicides will stop it in the track. A lot of fungicides don't cure it, they prevent it. So they're almost like a shield, although there are some that are systemic too. But in general, they will stop the fungal disease in its tracks. And that can be helpful, but sometimes it may be too late too. Large patch, which used to be called brown patch, is common, again, very common in zoysia, but also again on St. Augustine. And it's ever enlarging patches here. I would say, let me see if I have another picture. Yeah. As it develops, you start to see the center of it begin to green back up. So it starts to grow back. But at the outer edges of it, it's sort of a pink-orange color because the stems are actually rotting. As I mentioned too, high nitrogen will help this get worse. It may even trigger it. There are, and I've seen fungicides, they'll stop it in its track once it starts developing. But as you can see, it looks like, and again, generally this will happen, it will begin to fill back in after this, because the fungus like feeds and then goes out in this ever-expanding ring here. So the center part, if there's anything left alive, it's probably going to resprout and begin to fill in those areas. But not too much nitrogen it will really trigger it. Now this is one I included in here because it's relatively new. It's mosaic disease of St. Augustine grass, and it's caused by the sugarcane mosaic virus. And it's sort of hard to see, but these little clearer or yellower patches in here are indications of it. I think it's in Palm Beach, it may be in Pinellas County, it's not everywhere. And it probably jumped from sugarcane into St. Augustine grass. And it can kill entire lawns. So fortunately, we don't have it here. And the number one way it's spread is by lawnmowers, because the lawnmowers will cut the grass, they pick up all the sap from the grass, which has the virus in it, and then the next turf they go to, of course, they're cutting and introducing it. So there's no cure, and we'll just say that it's not here yet, and we'll stop with that. Does anybody want a break, or do you want me to continue? You can do with a head shake or whatever.
Continue.
I see you up in the air, so let's continue. Okay. All right. Although I'm going to give you a whole session on weeds, and we'll do a weed ID challenge, I think it's important to know them just for the purpose of a complete turf overview. And to get to know your weeds, a lot of it is going to be knowing the types of weeds. So generally, we're going to have broadleaf weeds. So we got dollar weed here. We have grassy weed, which is right here. It's hard to see, but that's common Bermuda grass mixed among some St. Augustine grass. And then you got sedges. And sedges are very grass-like, but they're different. And we'll talk about those. Then we've got annuals and perennials. Your classic annual here is crabgrass. Annuals go from seed to seed, generally in 1 year, although here in Florida, sometimes that happens quicker or later, depending on the weather. And then you got perennials that live year after year after year because they have generally some kind of underground storage organ, like a tuber or a bulb or a corm, that help it live longer. How do we manage weeds? Well, you know, just like a lot of things with integrated pest management, we try to do a lot of cultural practices. You know, it's hard to pick out a turf grass that's going to outcompete weeds, other than healthy turf grass generally will outcompete weeds, because weeds can live very well with a lot less, and so that's why they tend to outperform our good grass. So proper nutrients watering will make a good dense turf, keeps the weeds out to some degree. And of course, you know, weeds are always introduced one way or another. I remember at our old office, there was a weed called Southern Cedar. And if I parked on the grassy field next to the office, I would step on the Southern Cedar. And all of a sudden I noticed where I got out of my car at my house, where I stepped out, I had Southern Cedar. So I actually transferred it by my shoe from there to there. So anyways, so you want to be sure you're not introducing things like that. And some of it's sanitation too. And sometimes you have no control of this, but if you had somebody mows your lawn and they don't clean off their equipment, then they may be introducing weeds like the large Florida pusley or the Florida snow, which they do regularly. All right, some ways to suppress weeds. Mowing is one way, hand pulling and herbicides. Mowing will take care of annual weeds, because if the annual weed never gets to bloom, then it never produces seeds and its life is pretty much over. Perennial weeds, we can mow and mow and mow, and eventually it will starve out the reserves, and so we can do that too. Certainly hand pulling is very satisfying to a degree, but that's a lot of labor. And herbicides, again, can be used, but we want to use it last-ditch effort. We want to use it very selectively and properly. And speaking of herbicides, there's different types here too. A selective one is one that's going to damage, say, a broadleaf weed, but leave the grass intact. So as an example of that, atrazine. Now, atrazine is used as a selective weed control on St. Augustine, and it will kill certain broadleafs, but it will not hurt, under normal circumstances, the St. Augustine. However, when the temperatures get over 85, 90 degrees, we generally are going to stop using selective herbicides, because they can then start hurting the good grass too. Non-selective are going to be things like Roundup. They kill everybody they touch. Anything that's green, glyphosate will kill, and so that's considered a non-selective. Contact, that's going to be an herbicide that burns the tissue, it sort of burns the plant down, but it doesn't really go inside, versus a systemic like glyphosate, which enters in through the plant, gets translocated through the whole plant and kills it from the inside out, more or less. Timing is everything too. Now, we talked about different types of herbicides. A pre-emergent herbicide is used to kill weed seeds. So, you know, again, crabgrass, but any weed seed that is left by an annual plant is just sitting, waiting there to germinate. Now, it's going to need certainly temperature and water and sun and all that. But believe it or not, February 1st is the time we put down pre-emergence on our turf. And who knows what the weather's like then. It could be cold, could be hot, could be wet, could be dry. But it does have a bit of a residual strength. So what it does, though, is it kills the weed seeds before they germinate. So in a way, that's a perfect targeting thing to do, is to kill those weed seeds before they become a problem. These are just some of there's lots of different ones, but just as an example, Benefin, Bensalade, and there's others too, but they stop the weed seed right from the get-go. Post-emergence, as I mentioned, atrazine for St. Augustine. Again, you're only allowed to put 2 applications a year. Sometimes you can get atrazine with other herbicides too, but the bottom line is if the air temperatures exceed 85 degrees, you got to stop. You can't do it anymore because it will damage it. Bahia grass, generally 2,4-D is what we use. And again, there are air temperature limits too when you've got to stop using that. Now, weed and feed could be many different things. And the problem is, though, that it's got fertilizer and herbicide. So technically it is a pesticide, an herbicide. But the question is, do we need to put that all over our lawn? Not only for the fertilizer needs, maybe it's, who knows what the formulation is on it. Number one. Number two, maybe we don't have weeds all over our lawn, and spot treating with the specific herbicide may be a better way to go. I know it is convenient, but sometimes people are doing damage with it. And so you got to really, again, as with all pesticides, read the label. The label's the law. And so just that warning on the convenience of weed and feed to make sure that it's really necessary. All right, let's see how this is going to work, because I can't hear a word you're saying. So let me see. I'm going to go back up here, and I'm going to look at the chat. Let's see. Oh, I just really, just sound issues here. But I can go over the turf pre-questionnaire. And again, you can chat what any comments you want to see or say. Let's see here what you've done already. Okay. The first question, though, on that was St. Augustine grass is not very tolerant. True or false? Anybody can put it in.
Where is it? I can't see it.
It's on our test.
Oh, yeah. That I know. I thought it was on the screen.
Well,
I don't think it's very tolerant.
It's very tolerant, isn't it?
Or it
I'm
is
not
very
seeing it here on
tolerant.
my particular thing, but it is very salt tolerant.
Very
so that's
tolerant.
false.
Salt.
Okay. Number two, Bahia grass is best established with plugs.
False.
No.
False.
I'll try this chat again here.
No.
Is
Yeah,
he
it
gonna?
seems to be stuck. So the answer to that one is, oh, one new message. I see one new message. Ah, very good. Okay. Bahia grass is best established with plugs. Plugs is false because we're going to use either seed or sod in that case. Okay, next one. For best results, turf should receive 1 inch of water per application.
False.
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 False. Yeah.
It's, somebody's put.
Wait a
minute. Oh, I see all types of things coming. Well, remember that's really false. We want to use between 1/2 and 3/4 of an inch per application. 1 inch is too much generally, and it's going to go probably 12 inches through the soil and maybe past the roots. Okay, number 4, chinch bugs are a serious pest of Bahia grass.
That's false.
The
False.
answer is false. Remember, Bahia grass doesn't really have a problem with chinch bugs. It's mainly a St. Augustine grass problem. All right, 5, grass clippings are best raked up and removed from the lawn
False.
after each mowing.
False.
False.
Grass clippings are best raked up and removed from the lawn after each mowing. That would be false, of course, because it is taking away from the nutrients that could be reapplied or left on the lawn. 6, zoysia is considered the perfect grass.
False.
And of course, my answer to that would be false, because there are no perfect grasses. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. Number 7, Bahia grass has good wear tolerance.
False.
And as we know, that pretty much all these that we've talked about don't have very good wear tolerance. So,
Boy, I did false.
in number 8, footprints that remain on a lawn are an indication of overwatering. True or false?
True.
False.
Is an indication of drought stress, or it's
Drought stress?
needing
Drought.
to be watered. Number 9, Floratam St. Augustine is very resistant to chinch bug damage.
False.
That is false.
False.
And again, it may have had a little bit in the distant past, but don't consider it having any natural resistance. Number 10, Argentine lawn use. That is true. That is what we want to use. If we have our dithers to select a Bahia grass, Argentine is the way to go.
Okay.
Number 11, when mowing, make sure to remove at least 1/2 of the leaf blade. True or false?
False.
And that is false. No, you don't take any more than 1/3 of the blade off at any one cutting. And 12, the St. Augustine grass cultivars Telmar, Seville, and Captiva are all shade tolerant.
True.
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 That is true. Those are the dwarf cultivars that are drought tolerant. So, I think that concludes our turf piece in cyberspace here. I'd certainly, if you want to put any comments in the chat box, like to hear about the experience. I know we had some technical difficulties that we're still mopping up here, but I'm going to continue at least once a week. I may try it twice a week, but I'll let you know ahead of time. And these are recorded too. So if somebody misses one, that's okay, because you can watch it then on your own time. And I think Paul will help get that worked up. So we're going to try it again, as I mentioned, do ants and termites next Thursday, same time, 9:30, and Holly will certainly keep you up to date on that. And then I'll again continue to do what I can do, and then see what our guest speakers can do. Oh, okay. Got some questions here. Can anyone answer if pavers are considered impervious? I would say, again, can anyone answer if pavers are considered impervious? I would say you can buy impervious concrete, which does have the ability for things to go through it. I suppose the spaces in between the pavers would be pervious too, but pretty much if they're sealed, I guess they would be. Can you tell us which grasses go dormant? Well, probably the number one would be Bahia grass, and it has the natural ability to go dormant when it goes dry, and as soon as it rains or there's irrigation, it will green right back up. So that's the beauty of that particular one. Again, in a droughty season, we had one year, boy, they looked dead as a doornail, and somebody was actually selling the service of painting them. and you know, some of those paint colors are a little bit off, but this person had the perfect shade, and that was pretty darn good. But he did his lawn. I didn't see anybody else's, so maybe it was a short-lived service there. Supposedly zoysia grass, if it gets frosted or if it gets droughty, it can go dormant to some degree, but it's really ugly. Because zoysia further north, when it gets cold, it just turns brown. That's not going to look too good down here. So pretty much Bahia grass would be your one that would be the most dormant.
Ralph, can you hear me?
Any other questions? And again, I
Can
guess
you-
I am.
Can you hear me?
Here.
I hear you.
Let's see.
I can hear you.
Anything-
Okay, I have a
I want to
question.
thank you for your patience.
Wait, Ralph.
during
Ralph, can you
this,
hear me?
difficult time.
No, he can't hear you.
And
I can't hear.
Type it in the
just
chat.
hope that
I'm
you're
not
all
sure
well.
where to type it
And
in.
we'll try to keep
Here you
you
go on your screen.
in tune of things. And I know that I think Sarah has said, oh, Ralph, wait. But something's
I'm
coming
not
up.
sure how to type it in.
You know
So-
that
What's your
Go to
question
the
and I'll
bottom.
type it in.
Oh, hi, Sarah.
Sarah's been
What
sending
do
out
you
some,
do
and
if
Holly's
you
been sending
have,
out different
thatch
webinars and things. You can't
in your
hear
grass?
people asking questions.
My grass,
You
I
have a
cut,
question?
I
Okay,
have St.
just do it.
Augustine.
Just do it via the
I cut
chat
it on a
box because I
5.
can't hear anything.
Now I have a
for
lot
some
of
reason.
thatch
So,
because I
give me that
over-fertilized
question
when we first
in
moved
writing.
in.
Okay, I didn't hear your question.
I know.
Because I could hear Ralph and you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank
I'm
you,
waiting.
Sarah. I said when we first moved in 3 years ago, not realizing I
Hold on. Okay, hold on.
over-fertilized.
It's getting written. Hey. Oh, okay. Paul just passed to me the question about thatch. Again, as a definition, it's dead roots and shoots.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with grass clippings. Now, of course, there was an abandoned property and the grass got 2 feet tall and got cut. It's really going to mess it up quite a bit. So that may be an issue. But in general, thatch is a impenetrable barrier of dead roots and shoots. And inch or less is not a big problem. But when it becomes an inch or more, then you're going to get the grass roots growing up into it. So in a way, the grass becomes less drought resistant. And if the plug is pulled on the water, it's going to go down very, very quickly. I would say, too, that if you had it more than an inch, and you can actually make like a triangular cut and pull a plug of soil out, and you can see it. I mean, it's a definite layer of dead roots and shoots. And if you see that, again, the best time to do it is during the active growing season. So we'll say June through August is a good time. There are things called verticutters that you can rent. Not saying it's an easy job at all, and it's going to be a little traumatic on the turf, but it slices, instead of a mower doing horizontal, it does vertical cuts, and it will slice down through that layer. It will allow water and moisture and bacteria and organisms to get down in there, and that breaks up the barrier, and that should take care of it. Again, too much water and too much nitrogen are the main causes of that.
That's what happened. Yeah.
Any other questions, Paul?
Is Sarah, can you ask him, please?
Hey,
Is it Paul?
Paul. Oh.
Ralph, hold on.
This is like.
Okay, what do you want me to
Pony
ask him?
Express.
I'm sorry, Sarah. Ask him.
That's okay.
I cut St. Augustine on a 5.
Giving them, but again,
Is
I
that a
should be able to
problem?
see in the chat box.
Okay, St. Augustine.
Any questions?
I cut it on a level
People-
5
As height?
as height.
Another
Yeah.
question. St. Augustine on a
I got to find out how to tape this in.
at a 5-inch height.
Yeah.
5 inches. Okay. I would say you don't want to get it. You don't want to leave it too tall. But so 3.5 to 4 inches is probably the best height for it. I've heard concerns about too high, actually shading out some of the lower leaf blades. I'm sure 5 inches isn't that problematic, but I would say 4 is best. And if you can get that accurate of a measure with a lawnmower and a lawnmower blade and a ruler, that's good, because it is tricky in that different features of the landscape, the topography may cause you to mow a little lower accidentally when you go over a ridge or a bump or something. So you got to be careful. So as high as possible in that, I'm going to say 4 inches is good.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
No problem.
I got to learn how to
Looking
type
in the
this
old
in. I
chat
can't
box.
find it.
Can you hear me
Any
okay?
additional questions?
If you go down at the bottom, if
Uh-huh.
move your mouse around, go down at the bottom, and there should be a little box.
Anything else, Paul? Okay.
Oh.
It looks like we're
You see
we're
it?
done with this episode.
No,
She
not
says
yet,
thanks.
but I will, that's okay.
So I
I'll
thank
look
you for your
it.
patience
I don't even have
and
my
your
mouse
time.
here. I thought I
We
didn't
will
need it.
continue
So,
for this to keep going, and we will try to perfect our imperfections here as we move forward. So I'll see you next Thursday, the same bat channel, same bat time, and have a good rest of your day, week, and stay healthy. And we'll see you on cyberspace next time. Thank you.
thank you, everyone.